Welcome to the Marketecture podcast. I'm Ari Paparo. I'm joined today by Eric Franchi and Ratko Vidakovic, the founder of Ad Prof. So Ratko, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with some housekeeping. So first of all, this week on Marketecture TV, we released a in-depth video with Mark Grether, the head of Uber's advertising group. And because it's such an interesting episode and so much content, we decided to make that free to all subscribers. So you need to register at the site to see it, but there's no cost. So we'd recommend everyone do that and subscribe to our newsletter so you get updates on this great content coming out of Marketecture. Second point is we are still talking about bringing some advertising to this podcast. So if you'd like to reach thousands of ad tech and martech professionals each week, give me an email, Ari@Marketecture TV. And thirdly, next week is the Possible Conference, where both Eric and I will be hanging out. Ratko, will you be at Possible? Okay, say hi to Ratko too. So please reach out to us if you'd like to have a meeting or you want to talk, and maybe we'll even do some man-on-the-street interviews for next week's podcast. We're still trying to figure that out. We have to do that.
A couple of weeks ago, you said you were not going, and then something changed, and now you're going. What happened?
I don't know why I was not going. I don't know why I am going. I'm not self-aware enough to understand my decision processes.
That's fair.
All right. So, Ratko, you're known for your newsletter. That's one of the things people know you for, This Week in Ad Tech, which is funny because this podcast, we call it the Marketecture Podcast, but internally we call it This Week in Ad Tech. We just didn't want to call it that because you've used the name, and it's a great name. How did that come about? How did you start this newsletter, and tell us about it?
When I started AdProfs back in 2016, I knew right away that the marketing strategy was going to be centered around email. And so my initial goal was to build an email list of 1,000 people. And the way that I started doing it was by, writing some pretty long form articles on the website, tried to make them authoritative on topics like, header bidding, ad fraud, how to evaluate DSPs, that sort of stuff. And so for the first year, I just collected email opt-ins on the website just from, referral traffic and SEO. But it wasn't a very compelling value prop. It was sort of your typical sign up and get updates. So that turned out to be pretty slow. And I only had around, I think, 100 people on the mailing list after the first year. So then summer 2017, I was trying to figure out how could I publish something more frequently, something like every week related to the ad tech industry in a way that it could, drive growth of the email list. And so the sort of general concept of the weekly newsletter was the first piece of the puzzle. And so I was like, okay, what can I do every week that's unique and provides value to the reader? And that's where, the idea of basing it on industry news came in.
It's definitely endless. I mean, we entertain it every week. And every Monday, I create the notes for this podcast, and I have a news section. I always say, I hope there's some news this week. I hope we'll have something to talk about. And we've never had a problem. So it's endless.
Well, I mean, I would say like one of the limitations, like that's true, but also one of the limitations of the kind of weekly model is that maybe you guys will come to appreciate this in time, but there is a certain reliance on industry news coverage, which, tends to ebb and flow in terms of like what's newsworthy. So sometimes topics get repetitive, but for the most part, it is a pretty sort of endless stream.
Yeah, we've ended up talking about Twitter, and then the other 2/3 of our podcast, we've talked about the SSP, DSP conflict.
Yeah, what's interesting about what you do, Ratko, and how recently is you don't rely on industry news. You're sort of like creating your own content through service. So you're sort of like taking a trend, and then rather than sort of like reporting on the reporting, you're going direct to all of the constituents of your newsletter, which are primarily like people that work in the space, and you're providing, I think, some original insights from the people that are actually doing this stuff, which I think is awesome.
Thanks. Yeah, I added that over time. It was kind of like a new feature that I added after a few years of doing it. But yeah, I guess like kind of going back to the concept of the newsletter and kind of focusing on industry news, the sort of last piece was just the format. And so I decided to do something that I used to do as part of the leadership team at SiteScout, share snippets of articles that I found interesting and just add my comments to it. So why I thought it was important or wrong or where there's an opportunity, stuff like that. And, I kind of knew that everyone on the team is busy. You can't rely on people to read stuff. So when I shared the articles with them, I would, highlight specific sentences and just kind of make it really easy to digest. instead of just sending them like a link and saying, thoughts, ? So
Yeah, the highlighted parts of articles is pretty neat, easy to digest. I like the way you said that. So it's pretty big. Like, how many subscribers do you have at this point?
there's close to 12,000. So the
Oh my God.
yeah, so the high watermark was actually 14,000, but that was pre-pandemic. And so, yeah, because of the pandemic and layoffs and, emails bouncing and all of that, it kind of fell down a bit, but now it's like stabilizing at around 12K.
What's the composition?
No, I'd love to hear it. What is the composition? Agency,
Yeah,
people.
Yeah, and specifically, sector, and then if you break it down, presumably you do, like U.S. versus non-U.S.
I did the geo breakdown once. It was a very almost 50-50 balance between North America and Europe. There are people in like APAC, but for the most part, it's North America and Europe. And then I actually did analysis of the cities as well. So if you want to know the top ad tech cities, it's probably no surprise that New York is number one.
Is there anything not obvious?
Tel Aviv? How's Tel Aviv?
It's there. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was definitely there. It's if I remember, it was like New York, then London, then San Francisco, then Chicago, then Toronto, and then it just kind of like, it's like Paris and Berlin and stuff like that.
I was just going to bring up you're based in Canada, so let's have a shout out for Canadian ad tech. There's a surprising amount of Canadian ad tech.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think Index is a big representative in Toronto.
We have a startup we invested in Canada called Tave. You know Tave?
I don't think I've come across them.
Eric, not all Canadians know each other. It's a big country.
I thought it was like Jersey. I'm sorry.
So what's the business model? Are you making money from the newsletter, or is it mostly the consulting through Ad Profs?
It's pretty much a 50-50 split. So like 50% of the revenue is from consulting, 50% is from the paid newsletter. So, I mean, it's always kind of been a job because it was basically the core of the marketing flywheel for the business. But what ended up happening was, the production of the newsletter was just taking up a significant portion of my time. And so then I decided to sort of split the newsletter into two versions, one which is like a free summary and the other with sort of paid analysis. So it's kind of like freemium. And so, now it's absolutely a proper job.
Awesome. So what's going on in ad tech? Like, what are the hot topics, both in your newsletter that you're covering and also that you're being asked to consult on?
Sure. So I think everyone kind of talks about, commerce media and CTV and things like that as like opportunities. I think over the years of analyzing the industry, kind of seeing how the world is changing, it's pretty clear to me, like what's around the curve. One area is, I think, obviously privacy. I think it's always interesting just given how often things are evolving around ad tech, whether it's, the platform policies or the legal stuff. That said, I think a lot of people do find privacy boring or uninteresting. But, I think there's certain things that are going to change at some point, and it might not be tomorrow, but there's certain things that seem inevitable, like in terms of the writing being on the wall for certain practices. And so I think that part is sort of fairly predictable about where things are heading. So it's not maybe the most exciting thing, but I do think it is important just because of how much it impacts how ad tech companies make decisions, how they balance short-term, long-term priorities, their finite resources, that sort of stuff.
Right. So are you being pulled in as a consultant to help people predict the future or plan for the future as it relates to privacy?
Yeah. In some cases, for sure. Especially now, there's a lot more private equity activity happening in the space. And so helping with like due diligence, those sorts of projects.
Yeah. So private equity looks at some companies in ad tech and they're like, is this cash flow that we're seeing right here sustainable, or does it go away in 5 years? That's the question I always get asked by various people in the industry.
Exactly. It's like, what's the shelf life of their business model?
Do you have a framework for how you talk about some of the existing solutions and what you think needs to be built?
I don't know if I have a formal framework, but yeah, I do. I sort of think of it as balancing, like the short term and long term priorities. So that's why I try not to be too judgmental when it comes to things like, fingerprinting. It's, like every company has to balance the various, initiatives and various strategies that they have going on. So yeah, I try to just look at it by like, what's the shelf life of this? What's the likelihood of, certain practices being regulated or made illegal or stuff like that. So
what's your answer if I came to you and say I'm going to invest $1 billion in a company whose current business model is largely cookie based? What's your quick answer to get me excited to hire you as a consultant?
well, the quick answer would be, yeah, I mean, it depends, right?
Great consulting answer.
So that's one thing, but it's not just purely the negative part of privacy. It's kind of easy to focus on the negative, but I also think that there's definitely an opportunity in privacy as well, especially around compliance.
I mean, there's obviously a lot of plumbing. So if you're a participant in the industry or you want to anticipate the privacy changes, you have to do a lot of work, moving data around, changing the way you collect it. Like I would consider that all plumbing, and people need help doing that. But the strategic question is the bigger one, which is if you start thinking 4 or 5 years out, sure, third-party cookies are gone, but is IP address gone? Or is it illegal to use IP address? Is it illegal to fingerprint? These are kind of the existential questions that can move, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of value, depending on which way they end up.
Yeah, 100%.
That's the whole nature of investing in these later stage companies is evaluating those risks.
Yeah, I mean, the future is inherently unknowable. And so it's a question of probability is what's likely, what's unlikely. I think that's also one of the reasons why I like to ask some of the questions in the newsletter around, I think there was one question that was like, what do you think is the shelf life of fingerprinting? And it kind of, the answers were pretty bifurcated. So there was like one half of answers that were all like between 1 and 3 years. And then the other half were all like, yeah, it's going to be around like 5+ years.
Yeah, I definitely see that bifurcation myself.
And then as far as like the other thing, which is, I think you asked like what's interesting. I do think that, the whole decarbonization and sustainability trend, I think that's interesting as well.
You had a very interesting tweet on this subject, Ratko.
I did. Yeah. I mean, it was a joke, but there's always like a nugget of truth.
What was the tweet? I missed it. Like,
it was about I think it was about the spectrum of sustainability efforts or decarbonization efforts, and how it starts with just like, cutting off made for advertising sites all the way to like walk into the ocean.
Yeah, let me actually.
All right, see if we can follow it up. We don't have a producer on the show. So.
Producer Eric here. All right, and I quote from Ratko: "The spectrum of decarbonization efforts in ad tech: cut out MFA sites, buy via direct paths, buy direct from pubs, no RTB, use banners instead of video." This is where it starts to get fun. Use text ads instead of banners. Stop advertising. Shutter business. Reject worldly possessions. Walk into ocean.
That is great.
You are like so underrated as a tweeter. I hope that if nothing else, people follow you because you've got some great shit.
Thanks. Yeah, I need to get better at it, doing it more consistently. But yeah, I mean, I do think, like, jokes aside, I think one of the main things that makes the whole decarbonization thing interesting is just how it applies corporate leverage to what looks like essentially SPO, right? Supply path optimization.
Yeah, exactly.
So
yeah, well said.
You're using these like ESG mandates to push through stuff that I think everybody should have been doing anyways.
Yeah,
like Jounce has been pioneering the space last few years. So I don't think anybody would disagree that cutting out all the crappy sources of supply or questionable practices like bid duplication is wasteful. But now you have this real impetus at the corporate level, this real like imperative to make it happen. So you have real leverage now to apply these SPO efforts.
Yeah, when I interviewed Brian O'Kelly for Marketecture TV, it was our first interview, and he was telling me all about Scope 3. I kind of pushed him on this a little bit, which is, isn't this just going to benefit simple sites with very little advertising with direct paths? And he's basically said, yeah, and that's good. It's just the waste from carbon is acting like a proxy for good advertising practices. And I don't know if other industries are the same. It's kind of a happy coincidence in our industry, I think.
Yeah, no, it's very clever. And I think it's by attaching like a carbon score to all these things, I think it also just makes makes it more concrete. That being said, I am a bit skeptical just by nature. And so I do think that maybe the methodology, I'm not quite sure of. Like, I think there might be still work to do there. But it'll get there in time. Like, I think one example, like one of those proxies was like looking at the length of an ads.txt file as a proxy for publishers, carbon footprint or something like that.
Yeah, it is kind of, there's a lot of estimates and nonsense. And not to mention the fact that the main output of all of this is the opportunity to buy carbon credit. There's a lot of belief that carbon credits are a bit of a scam too. But it's pointing in the right direction, and I think we could all go along for the ride, and hopefully no one gets injured.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because it's like a whole new angle, basically, to how the industry operates.
Yeah. What else is interesting, Ratko?
I'll tell you what's exciting,
Even better.
which is a little bit different. And so I just want to say, like, first, I don't get excited very easily.
I've never met you, but I feel like that's the case.
Yeah, like I don't like using exclamation marks. Generally speaking, I think, there's the whole Seinfeld episode, right, about exclamation marks. But yeah, I tend to not use exclamation marks, things like that. But just watching the rapid development of AI over the last few months has been legitimately exciting.
What's exciting about it relative to ad tech, relative to, I think, all the areas that it can be applied?
I guess, like, I never bought into the whole crypto or blockchain or Web3 or any of that, especially for ad tech. It's like a pretty good sign if somebody tries to attach one of those things to like ad tech. It's like, good rule of thumb is you can ignore it. But I'm incredibly bullish on AI, and I've been casually playing around with it. First with like the OpenAI stuff that they had available for like almost a year. I think it was like GPT-3. But when ChatGPT came out in December, it really felt like a big acceleration in what was possible. And lately I've been playing around with GPT-4 and the Whisper API. So I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that.
No, I'm not familiar with Whisper. What is that?
So Whisper is their transcription API service. And I'm blown away by the potential opportunities there. So as far as like AI and ad tech go, I think there are sort of obvious opportunities that people have been highlighting, things like, AI powered creative generation, testing, campaign optimization, things like that. Maybe even a sort of next generation brand safety or contextual targeting. But I think the non-obvious opportunity, and a big one that I see, comes from the drastic improvements in the AI-powered transcription, sort of as the core. So they recently released the Whisper API. I tested it out firsthand. It's surprisingly accurate, but I think more importantly, it's 100 times faster and 100 times cheaper than traditional transcription services. And I think this creates a ton of opportunity. To give you like a concrete example, transcribing an hour of audio takes about a minute and to execute, and it costs around 32 cents.
So what's the implication for ad tech? Is it better targeting on audio and video? Is it more made for advertising websites, which would not be a great thing?
You're thinking heading in the right direction. So I think it has massive sort of applications in the audio space and in the video space, basically places where text has typically been absent. Now, when you have cheap automated transcripts, somebody could start by, building these massive data sets of text, either broadly or in specific, niches. And then once you have that sort of corpus of text, I think you can do all sorts of interesting things. You can train these, large language models. You can create chat interfaces for sort of asking those data sets questions. You could build a traditional search engine for that audio content, which would allow for down the road, search ads business to be built on top of it. You could add social aspects to podcasts, basically, where, perhaps people could comment on specific segments of the audio. I just think the whole podcast space in general is very archaic.
Yeah, I've actually been looking into this exact subject because Marketecture at this point has over 100 hours of detailed, in-depth content on ad tech and martech. And so transcribing and training an AI on that is top of mind for me. Let's just say that.
Yeah, that would create like all sorts of, I think, interesting derivative products and opportunities and like research. So I think that's actually super exciting and, extends beyond just the ad tech use case. The other thing that I'm spending more time on, and we actually made an investment last quarter our first investment is just, how AI and some of this generative stuff can really start to impact workflow and like how people work in ad tech. And ad tech is always interesting because it's has such like obvious pain points and obvious like opportunities. So there's more data than any other category besides finance, and the number of transactions per second, everything like that led to programmatic. I think one of the areas that's really interesting and can be attacked is just like how much manual work still gets done, how many like spreadsheets are just like cranked out to be put into a presentation, to be overlaid with a little bit of like human insight on what they remember to ship to a client and everything like that. I'm seeing, like real interesting innovation. Again, it's not an ad tech thing, but I think ad tech is perhaps like the beachhead or lighthouse market for this, on just like AI to help workflow and just like free up people's time in the same way that you pointed to, an hour of audio, basically being transcribed and delivered in a minute. I think that's coming for a lot of the manual processes that happen at the client side, the agency side, basically everywhere.
Yeah, I completely agree.
One thing I'm interested in your opinion on, because I get asked this a lot, which about AI's impact on optimization and data targeting. And my answer goes something like this. And Ratko, I want to pressure test this. So tell me if you agree with this, which is ad tech and programmatic has millions of events every second with hundreds of data points on each event. And there's been a lot of investment in optimizing outcomes based on that. And whether you call them AI or not, they've already been invested in, they've been optimized, and you can get better, but we're probably pretty close to the efficient frontier on optimization based on these signals. So this latest round of LLMs and GPT and all of that isn't really a needle mover for the core optimization problem. Am I an idiot? Is that smart? What do you think?
Yeah, what I was thinking about the exact same thing. So I agree. You have all these custom bidding algorithm companies, right? Is that who you're referring to?
No, I'm just saying in general. Someone might have a thesis that like you could displace one of the current DSPs with just better algorithms because of AI, and I'm just a little skeptical on that because I think the algorithms from the core DSPs or from independents like Chalice or whomever, they're already pretty optimized. I don't think there's room for disruption here.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's going to be such a magnitude change, at least in bidding decisions, because here's the thing about bidding, and I'm sure you appreciate this having been on the demand side, but speed is such a huge factor.
Yeah.
And so like, I'm not sure that the most advanced LLMs today that I've seen are kind of slow. Like they're more accurate, they can reason better, but they're not as fast as like older models. So I'm not an AI expert.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, I agree with you. I think that there's like limits to how much you can optimize bidding decisions.
All right, let's transition to some of the news of the week. I'm going to start off by going on a little bit of a rant, hopefully not too bad, because
Oh boy.
oh boy. So, two different Twitter threads or news articles came out this week with more or less the same argument. The first one was from Julie Angwin, a New York Times opinion columnist, and the second was from the author Cory Doctorow, who was on Boing Boing, and he writes young adult fiction. I actually like his fiction a lot. He wrote a book called Little Brother that was excellent. But that's not the point. The point is that both of these writers made the same false argument, which goes something like this. Back in the old days, people bought media based on context. You wanted to be in the New York Times, to be with the New York Times, and everything was good. And then the bad digital people came in, started stealing all your data, created surveillance capitalism. And because, this is the important part of the argument, because of behavioral advertising, the value of journalism and traditional media declined because advertisers can find the audience whatever they wanted, and they didn't have to buy the New York Times anymore. That's a summary of the argument. There's also a corollary to the argument about the value of the products being advertised in behavioral. So let's hold on that one for a point. So I want to first debunk the basic theory here. So there's several problems with this theory, and it's pretty obvious to anyone who's a practitioner why this is totally wrong. The first one is that it assumes it's a zero-sum game, that there's a single pool of advertising that would have gone to the New York Times, but instead went elsewhere because of behavioral advertising. And that is just utterly false because it misses the point that behavioral advertising is so effective that the entire pie grew enormously over the last 20 years. So digital advertising skyrocketed because of the ability to do things you couldn't do previously. Technology created innovation, made the pie bigger. That's point one. Point two is this idea that the New York Times, et cetera, all the premium publishers would have reaped all the value of advertising if not for behavioral advertising. That's also false because the core problem the traditional media companies had was they were disintermediated by the internet. And so consumers could find their news elsewhere through search and through Facebook and through, blogs and things like that. And that was an important point. And the second related point is that it's very inefficient to buy the audiences on these traditional publishers because the audience is highly fragmented. There are billions of people around the world consuming news. And it's just a different critical mass of audience on these sites than it used to be when you bought a newspaper and it was in every New Yorker's hands on the subway. So I'll stop there with my rant. But it really drives me crazy how often this false point of view comes up. It comes up all the time from people who are basically someone in my thread called them drive-by experts. They're people who do not have expertise in advertising, but have strong opinions about advertising. Eric, do you want to tell me why I'm wrong?
I try not to react when I read a thread like that, when I read tweets like that. I really try to understand the perspectives of the writer. And I think they're just coming from a place, to your point, of, maybe not as deep in terms of expertise. And I think a place of nostalgia. I think you're right. I would add two things. Number one, what most folks don't talk about, although I think there was like a reaction thread to one of these threads, was it wasn't just how the internet disrupted local news. It's also Craigslist.
Craigslist destroyed the newspaper business.
Yeah, because the newspaper business, one of the, maybe not like it's a secret, but, classifieds was how most of the newspaper businesses, actually, kind of were profitable and had a substantial amount of their revenue. And Craigslist completely gutted the classifieds category, on an extremely low cost or even free basis, right? So when the finger pointing goes around, nobody points fingers at Craig. So I think that's I think an additional dynamic. The other thing here that's, I think not appreciated perhaps is just a very sort of helpful and user-friendly concept. If you think about some of the use cases for digital advertising, you think about B2B. If I'm a decision maker at a B2B company and I'm in market for some sort of $250,000 licensing agreement, and there's a handful of vendors that I need to be evaluating, why should I be getting ads about gardening when I'm reading something, when I'm such a high value prospect for a handful of companies that I want to be informed on to make my decision? How does that make sense from a user perspective? And you start to just extrapolate that out. And that's why, Instagram ads, they're so darn effective. I open up Instagram and I get ads for jiu-jitsu apparel and jiu-jitsu equipment. And that's what I get. And that's really all I care about outside of my kids and my family and my business. So it's, it's so not respecting of, I think it's not respectful of the user. I'll end my rant there.
Kids, family, and beating people up. That's Eric's day. Ratko, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think you're bang on. I love a good rant, and I agree. I think the internet, I think they're just basically shaking their fist at the entire internet, because the internet newspapers specifically, they had a monopoly on distribution, and they lost that monopoly when the internet came around, and content became essentially limitless. So many alternatives to where people get their news or where they get their content, and I think that, in addition to other things, just massively weakened them, from a monetization perspective and from a traffic perspective.
Yeah, there's some sub-threads to these arguments. One of the sub-threads is that contextual advertising is the best and it works great. And as practitioners, we all know what a joke that is because there is an enormous amount of internet content that lacks context. Think about mobile games. There's no context to mobile games. There's really very little context to social networks. When Google did the deal many years ago, I'm dating myself, Google did this big deal to get exclusive rights to advertise on MySpace, and it was really unsuccessful. It was a terrible deal for Google. And what they called it was the contextual desert. They said MySpace is literally about nothing. It's like the Seinfeld website. There's no context. Every page is just a blob of gray ooze, and we couldn't advertise anything on it. And a lot of the internet's like that. So contextual doesn't work. It doesn't scale. And the places that have the best context are often places that advertisers want to avoid, like hard news. There's a lot of context about disasters and tornadoes and wars, and that's not what people want. So that's one of the sub-threads of this general uninformed argument. The other sub-thread, this is actually interesting. I'm interested in your point of view on this, which is part of this reason these threads started this week was because there was this study that some professors did that said that the products being advertised through behavioral advertising were lower quality products that also cost more. And that kind of gave me a little bit of a head scratcher as to why we cared. Is it, so what? It was kind of my reaction. It's a product you're offering that's advertised. That's capitalism. I don't know. Was I missing something there?
Yeah, I mean, they seem like their main grievance, at least the New York Times article, the perceived surveillance or the profiling that was associated with like this specific razors advertiser. And, so it really seemed kind of like hinged on that, but they were kind of making very sweeping generalizations about the type of advertisers that benefit from highly targeted ads. And I think that the study was based on Facebook, if I recall right. So, I mean, I think that says more about having a self-serve ad platform with very low barriers of entry than it does to the targeting methodology.
Yeah, it was like a right-wing razor brand that was one of the examples. I think given what's happening in the United States, like if you're a right-wing entrepreneur worth your salt, you're creating a right-wing version of every single brand out there. They're going to be right-wing condoms, right-wing power bars, right-wing shoes. I don't know. As long as it just own the libs with your consuming power is kind of the entrepreneurial trend right now. And the New York Times sort of objected to that.
Yeah, and I think even at that point, I think it's fair to say like that some of the targeting does enable some of the divisiveness and some of the political messaging. So I think it's maybe fair to acknowledge that, but at the same time, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, I don't think makes sense.
Are there any right-wing condoms? Has anyone done a right-wing condom brand? Because something that you can make a shooting metaphor there.
A free startup idea.
Free startup idea. Right-wing condoms. Shoot your shot. Okay.
Editor.
I'm going to have to click in my podcasting. I'm going to have to click the NSFW checkbox this week. Okay. Permutive had some layoffs. It's always unhappy news. Don't love layoffs, but it was pretty big. So 40% of staff. They said they hired a head of revenue. Permutive, for those of you who don't know, is a publisher-facing context company. They basically, in a privacy-protected way, collect data about what consumers are viewing on publisher sites and then enable advertisers to buy ads in a privacy-protected contextual way. 40% of staff laid off. Is this the death of contextual? Is this just a blip? Is this something we should care about?
I mean, I just think that, so generally speaking, I usually don't include stories about layoffs in the newsletter, especially when they're more like industry-wide, because I think like Permutive is not the only company that's laying people off. But to your point, it is pretty high magnitude, and it is a bummer. But as far as like what I would extract from that, it does seem to be that everyone at least seems to me to be like battening the hatches with sort of expectations of tough times ahead. I'm not totally sure if it's like an indictment on their product, but that's just my opinion. I'm not sure.
Was this caused in part by Google putting off its Chrome deprecation of cookies year after year? Was Permutive a bet on privacy that is turning out to take longer than anyone expected?
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Our disagreement. Go ahead, Ratko.
Sure. Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, I don't think that the the delay and the deprecation of cookies did these kinds of companies any kind of favors, because you're right. There's a certain bet that the future reality was going to look a certain way, and that advertisers would basically be forced to use certain tactics and kind of go to publishers and buy their data directly and all these sorts of things. And I don't think Google did anybody any kind of favors by or at least didn't do these kinds of companies any kind of favors when it came to like the urgency of adopting their products. So I
urgency. Yeah, I totally agree with you about urgency. Eric, tell us why we're wrong.
Yeah, I don't know how many publishers buy these solutions to be future proofed versus being able to capitalize on the revenue opportunities of today. And I think companies like this have good solutions, and companies we're seeing ROI. I think it's a little bit more of just general market conditions. I do recall they staffed up pretty aggressively after they raised that round. I believe it was SoftBank that led it. So, if the market slows down, if, customers are taking long to sign contracts or renew, that's just the tea leaves, and you need to make adjustments accordingly. But I could be wrong about, publishers buying on the future proof strategy. It's just not typically something that you see from them.
Yeah, they really did grow pretty fast. So while we're on the subject of contextual, I think last week with the publisher panel, we talked about this on again, off again thing where European publishers are getting angry with contextual vendors about, and I put in air quotes, stealing our data, unquotes, by scraping their websites and selling that data to advertisers. So Ratko, you did a poll about this from your newsletter subscribers. You want to walk us through that?
So I think like the main gripe that the publishers have seems to be with the verification vendors. So when I first heard this story and read this story, I thought it was like with all contextual targeting. And I do think that there is an aspect of it. There's a bit of like conflation there, but I do think that it's primarily with the verification vendors because, the classification crawlers or scrapers, they're the same as the verification, basically technology, right? So if publishers want to block them from the contextual classification part, they're also harming themselves because they would also be blocking the verification as well.
Right.
So I think they just feel like they're kind of backed into the corner in that regard. I think it's like it's understandable.
I feel like this complaint is not about what it's really about, which is that publishers feel like the verification vendors are adversarial towards them. And then the fact that they also sell their data to the same people that they're verifying just really rubs them the wrong way.
Yeah. And then the whole part about like stealing, like publishers claiming that the contextual classification of their URLs, that belongs to them, I think is a little bit absurd.
Yes.
Publishers, they publish a web page on the internet. It has a URL. Contextual provider classifies, the contents of that page into categories. I think that's the contextual vendor's data. It's their classification of the article. They're categorizing the URL. They're not copying the information or repurposing it like a large language model, for instance. So
Right. One interesting point here, I had Mark Zagorski on Marketecture TV, the really good interview, once again, very in-depth about their business. And he threw out a stat, I may be misremembering it, but 80% of their revenue is data sales. Only 20% is verification. I thought that was
It's double verified for everybody.
Yeah, double verify. Sorry.
now, is that also brand safety, or is that purely targeting?
Yeah, brand safety, all pre-bid stuff.
Got it. Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of the poll, so the last question of the week was, what should ad verification companies do about their contextual targeting products in light of these publisher concerns? And 53% of the responses said they should enable some kind of opt-out mechanism. 34% said they should share the revenue, and 14% said they should do nothing.
Yeah, this is kind of like asking kids when they think their bedtime should be. But I get the point.
What's perplexing is that one would expect that the types of publishers that are making noise on this, presumably they're sort of like premium publishers with a business. One would expect that these are the types of publishers that benefit from these solutions most as well.
Yeah, and that's also the part where I have, I take issue with the whole compensation part. Like in terms of the sharing the revenue, because last time I checked, publishers are compensated every single time an advertiser decides to buy an ad. on whatever.
Sounds like the ad tech tax.
Yeah. So it's like, it's almost like, it's like, do you want to get paid twice for the same impression?
Yeah, I think it's there's not a lot of logic here. Also, I think it's interesting. One of the things that really frustrated me at my last company, Beeswax, was that the basic OpenRTB programmatic protocol includes contextual information. There's a whole node of OpenRTB for the context based on IAB categories. And what is annoying is that it is universally ignored. Nobody uses it, and we recommended to our clients not to use it because they lie. The publishers lie. The publishers always want to be sports and auto and all these cool categories when in fact they're not. And that's why this whole additional cost, let's call it that, exists. If there was some way that SSPs had clamped down on this and could guarantee that the context was accurate, the world would be a better place, and everyone could, not have to pay the 10-cent CPM or 25-cent CPM to a third party. But that's not going to happen. That train left the station a long time ago.
You're totally right. It's an unreliable. So when we were building the DSP, same deal, right? Like it's an unreliable signal. The category attributes.
Yeah, they're totally unreliable. All right, with that, I think we're gonna wrap this up. So please follow Marketecture TV online on Twitter and LinkedIn. We post our videos there about once a week, and subscribe at Marketecture TV to our newsletter. With that, Ratko, thank you so much. This was a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Ratko.
Thank you for subscribing to Marketecture. New interviews are added every week at marketecture.tv and your favorite podcasting app.